So, my talk is going to be a little different in that it focuses on the work of a single artist. And this is an artist who's included in the exhibition Radical Software. So if you haven't been over there yet, I strongly encourage you to go check it out. And this is the artist Vera Molnár, who was born in 1924 in Budapest and passed away just over a year ago in Paris in 2023. And she's known as sort of the grande dame of digital and generative art, though as Margit pointed out, digital is a little bit of a misnomer sometimes because there was a lot of different ways to think about computing before the digital computer as well, and I think Molnár falls into that legacy as well. So I like to think that she's sort of an unlikely hero of this art and technology boom, and especially the recognition she got later in her life, where she captured the attention of the kind of NFT blockchain crowd as a 90-something pioneer of working generatively and digitally. Because she was not at all a technical person, a technical artist. She was trained in painting and, as I'll say in a couple slides, always identified primarily as a painter. So at a moment when a lot of artists, or I guess folks saying they were making art with computers, were coming at it more from kind of working in engineering or working in mathematics and then developing a visual language out of that. She was very much coming at it from a more fine arts and painting perspective. So then the question arises of how did she come to do this? How did she come from being a painter to suddenly making these geometric compositions with a mainframe computer that was the size of, several refrigerators in the laboratory? And this is what I'm going to briefly talk about today and really focus on these early years of her generative art practice. And we'll look at some images that are in the show, as well as talking about some of her writings from the 1970s, as well as many of the oral history interviews that I did with her. This is just a fun image of us together in 2021. Sure. So I typically am not a big fan of chronological order, but just for the sake of, transparency and wanting to make sure you all follow along, I have this slide that just sort of goes over how I'm going to walk you through her career trajectory. And we're mainly going to focus on the late 1960s and the 1970s, which was when she was working with mainframe computers. And that's also the decade that's the best represented in the exhibition as well. So Molnár was born in 1924 in Budapest, Hungary, to a comfortably bourgeois, secular Jewish family. And that biographical detail was actually something that I discovered in the archives and was not something that she wanted to speak about publicly in her lifetime. But she attended art school in Budapest during World War II, and that, could take up an entire presentation just to talk about her early life. But what's interesting is that in 1946, which was also when she legally changed her last name to sound less obviously markedly Jewish, she also started making her first abstract drawings. And these are just some examples that are now held at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. So in 1947, she left Budapest and she moved first to Italy and then to Paris, where she stayed for the rest of her life.
Okay.
And as I said before, her whole life she identified as a painter, even when she wasn't using paint. I think it was the principles of painting, the kind of theoretical questions about painting and the sort of aesthetic experience that she was really held closely to her heart in her whole career. So this is a paper that she wrote in 1975 for the journal Leonardo, which is this interesting journal that really combines the format of a scientific journal with content that focuses more on art and art history. So it's a lot of artists working with new media, writing about their practices. And so here you'll see the very first sentence of her essay is, "I am a painter, an image maker," in particular of images of a non-figurative kind. So ever since she made those works in 46, she almost exclusively worked on abstraction, and specifically geometric abstraction, the rest of her career.
Good.
And in her first decade in Paris, she was actually collaborating a lot with her husband, Ferenc or François Molnár, who she had met at art school, who came to Paris with her. And they worked together in the style of art concret, or concrete art, concrete Kunst, which was essentially about not making any references to the natural world, working pretty much primarily in geometric shapes, and even with kind of predetermined compositions, so sort of executing a painting according to rules. So it was very systematic, it was very mathematical, very methodical. And what they would do is they would work with collages, and they would arrange them on the wall and kind of collaboratively come up with a composition. And then Vera Molnár would translate that collage into an oil painting. So that's what we're looking at here. And on the right is a photograph that she took of her husband in 1954. That's, you know, it's a joke, and it's François Molnár dressed up as a painter. He's wearing a smock, a bucket hat. He has paint brushes in his hand. And what she said to me in an interview was that he was trying to prove to people that what they were doing was legitimately painting, because a lot of the flack they were getting at the time from especially like family friends was that this wasn't painting. But what's also funny on another layer is that François never really touched these paintings with a paintbrush. It was Vera that did all the handiwork there, all the physical labor of making the painting. So their final collaborative canvas was this one, which is a quite big painting from 1960. And what's interesting about their dynamic is that her husband, after they moved to Paris, sort of retrained as a experimental aesthetics researcher, so sort of perceptual psychology, studying how eye movement works, for example, when we look at a painting. And Vera, on the other hand, while she had a degree in art education and had worked as a teacher in Hungary, she didn't particularly enjoy that work, and so they came to this conclusion that only one of them would work, and Vera stayed home, kind of took care of the household, and also worked full-time on her art at home. And so she has this joke that the only reason she was able to be a full-time artist was because she was a housewife. And she would always use these words very dryly and facetiously, and she never identified with feminism, and she actually quite aggressively rejected that label. But when I actually spoke to her, a lot of her kind of life philosophies and the way she lived her life very much sounded feminist to me. So that was always an interesting contradiction in her kind of self-mythologization, if you will. So in 1960, the Molnárs co-founded the Centre de Recherche de l'Art Visuel, which was later known as CRAV. You might know it as CRAV with the G. And this was a group that was invested in collective artistic practice. So really suppressing the role of individual authorship and kind of individual genius, and instead working together using these geometric forms and really thinking about making art accessible to a wider public. So about, I think, 4 months after founding the group, the Molnárs resigned from the group, citing a disagreement in the definition of research in the title of the group, because Francois in particular felt that despite this kind of anti-capitalist ideology that the group had, the artists were still selling and showing their art in the commercial art world. He didn't like that. So from that point on, Francois quit painting officially, really devoted himself to research, and Vera kind of left in solidarity with him, and she became kind of the sole visual artist in the couple. But they remained lifelong friends with the rest of the CRAV artists, such as François Morlet, who they continued to work with over the years. So then when did Vera Molnár become interested in the computer? There's an interesting conceptual connection that emerges in her thinking, but also more broadly in Paris at this time, between concrete art and kind of the possibility of creating with a computer. So she had read about computers in the 1950s, but didn't know how to access one. And so she developed this method of working that she called the machine imaginaire, the imaginary computer. And this was a way for her to make series of work, including this collage that you see here on the right, collage series, where she would use randomness, essentially. So she would throw dice or use the telephone book pointing at a random number, and kind of simulate the experience of what she imagined working with a computer would be like, sort of ceding some of the artistic control of decision-making to these automated processes, more or less. And she continued to be really invested in this idea of challenging the art historical paradigm of artists seen as these individual geniuses, and really trying to debunk that that kind of myth, which, you know, she doesn't explicitly talk about how gendered that concept is, but it's interesting to read some of her writing from the early 70s where she's talking about genius that sounds very, very similar to early feminist art history, such as the Linda Nochlin essay that Margaret just referenced. And so again, while she was not officially a feminist, her ideas were really not dissimilar to what was going on in feminist art theory at the time. And so she really became involved in this circle of friends in Paris who were interested in using algorithms to generate works of art. And most of them were in music or in poetry rather than in visual art. So she was good friends with Pierre Barbeau, who's pictured here on the left, with one of her works, and Janine Charbonnier, who they were part of a groupe de musique algorithmique at the time. And she was also good friends with Abraham Moll, who was kind of the French counterpart to Max Benza. So he was a philosopher, sociologist who was developing this theory of information aesthetics, which is hard to summarize, but a lot of it had to do with kind of understanding beauty and understanding aesthetic experience in a kind of quantitative way. And he eventually published this book on art and computers and included Vera's work in there. Oops. So it was Pierre Barbeau, her friend, who introduced her to mainframe computing for the first time. And that was in 1968, when Barbeau was an artist in residence or a composer in residence at Boule, which was a computer manufacturer in Paris. And the work, the very early work, looked like this, and I'll show a detail on the next slide. In Molnár's words, the work was very ugly. She didn't realize when she was first going to use this machine that she wouldn't be able to use color. And so she essentially had to print a listing of her program output and then use it almost like this paint by numbers, where she then hand colored the composition. And so then she kind of had to adjust her method to think more about how to work within the actual parameters of, or kind of the limitations of the medium. So thinking about maybe using more simple geometry, which was easier to program, as well as working with black and white, because that was what the computer plotters, which I'll show in a minute, were able to execute more easily at least at that particular institution. And so then she first learned how to program in Fortran at a class that was offered likely at this computer lab that she was working at throughout the 70s. And then later in the 70s and into the 80s, she was working with BASIC, the programming language. And so these were the days of what was called, and this is probably a ableist term, blind computing, which meant that you essentially couldn't see what you were doing. You were working with punch cards, and then you wouldn't see the results of your program until sometimes days later, depending on how much of a kind of wait list there was before you and how complicated your output was. And so there was this massive time delay between inputting and seeing your output. And So at this point, in the early 70s, she'd begun working at a institute in Orsay, just south of Paris, called the Centre Interrégional de Calcul Électronique, which was basically a conglomerate of different sort of university and research centers that shared a computing center. And she has this kind of anecdote as to how this came about. And of course, anecdotes are hard to fact check, and sometimes they are, not true, but I think they give insight into kind of the contours of the situation, the politics of the moment. And so actually, if you look at these timestamps on her work, which you can see these in the exhibition, they actually tell you exactly when they were computed. So you can figure out, if we had more time, I would have you guess what this means, but I'm just going to tell you. 74 is, of course, 1974, and then 338 is the 338th day of that year. And so I was sort of able to figure out when she was usually in the computer lab, and it was typically on Wednesday afternoons and Wednesday evenings and Saturday afternoons. So basically times when the engineers worked there. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Not doing great on time. I'll hurry up. But then Molnár refers to her program that she wrote with her husband. And the common misconception there is that her husband was actually the one writing the programs, because there's no way that a woman would have known how to code in Fortran. It must have been her husband. But in fact, her husband didn't really know how to code either, and so they were both just kind of stumbling through it together, and then eventually ended up hiring unpaid students to help them with the coding. And something I wanted to note here is that in the early days, she was kind of encouraged by people to remove those sort of timestamps from the plotter printouts. And so you don't have the kind of timestamps on these early works. This is a work in the show from 1968. And then later, you have more intact the timestamp, as well as these sprocket holes from the continuous feed paper. And she later said that the job from Molnár timestamp made her work more valuable than her actual handwritten signature, because the signature was forgeable, but the timestamp was not. So I just wanted to say that we typically think about, or I guess it's tempting to think about an artist begins to work with a computer, and then maybe you would think they never looked back and they never went back to kind of more traditional media, but she was always shuttling back and forth between painting and drawing and algorithmic plotter drawings. And also, the largest turning point in her career, I would argue, is not the 1968 start of the mainframe computer, but actually this moment around 1972 where the lab she was working at got its first screen. And this was the IBM 2250, which is featured in Herbert V. Franke's book, as well as it was the same one in the first presentation that Janice Lurie was working with the light pen. Molnár didn't use the light pen, but for her it was really, really significant to have this way to actually instantaneously visualize her results, to not have to wait days to see what she was programming. And this is just for scale, that's Bob Ross right there. This is the size of the IBM 2250, and here on the left is a photograph that she took of it, which interestingly she didn't really consider an artwork. And I found these amidst her kind of like family photos. So I say that because I think it's really important to note how significant it was for her emotionally to be able to visualize her results instantaneously. And also, not only to visualize instantaneously, but also to respond to what she was seeing on screen and to be able to intervene and to really go back and forth. And so this is really the beginning of what we call interactive computing. And so the name that she gave this process was conversational computing, or a conversational method, which I think refers to the French word for interactivity, which was conversationnel. And so just on a closing note, I think Molnár was always very skeptical of the idea that the computer was an objective tool. And she would always talk about how it was impossible to argue that authorship was actually suppressed or absent in this kind of work. Because even if her hand wasn't involved, she did write the program, right? There's always a person behind the algorithm. Even with AI, somebody did create that and train it. So basically this idea that computers can't create without us. And just as a final plug, in the 1980s, she did move into personal computing. And as I mentioned, she learned BASIC. And what's interesting is that she never used computers beyond this moment. So kind of in the early 90s, she stopped coding. And I've wondered a lot why. And I think perhaps one of the reasons is that the text-based, the command line-based programming was somehow, it was more mathematical, so it was more in line with kind of this history of concrete art. And it also allowed her to work with randomness in a way that I think maybe she would have felt like she had too much control in something like a paint program or something like that. I think a lot of her motivation was actually about ceding control and finding that kind of sweet spot between using her own intuition and then using the randomness of the computer, which she referred to as a sort of intuition or like pseudo-intuition of its own. And so if you're interested in learning more about that moment and what that code looked like, I'm giving this workshop tomorrow on retro computing at the Kunsthalle, and I think there might still be some spots open. And we'll be looking at this artwork, which is also in the show. And finally, if you want to stay in touch, there's my email address, and that's a picture of my dog, my other dog, because it's his 16th birthday today. So, thank you.